It's wonderful to welcome Johan Norberg of the Cato Institute on this program once again. Uh, I believe the last time we spoke, we talked about the great Scottish economist Adam Smith, and now we're talking his latest book, Johan, not Smith, obviously, is entitled Peak Human: What We Can Learn from the Rise and Fall of Golden Ages. Johan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Glad to be back.
So first, I'd like to ask you, what inspired you to write the book?
Well, yes. Why do I write about golden ages in history and their rise and fall? I guess one part of it is obviously some worry about our present civilization and whether we have any ideas from the past with which to extend the lifespan of this golden age or not. At least it's a trove of material, of knowledge about what has been not just the mistakes of the past, but also what's been done right in the past. So I thought that was valuable to look at.
Certainly. Okay, so you've listed seven examples to look upon. Uh, okay, they are one, Athens; two, Rome; three, the Abbasid Caliphate; Song China; Renaissance Italy; the Dutch Republic; and the Anglosphere. So why seven and why these seven?
Yeah, I had to limit myself to some, not to make the book too long. And what I tried to do then was narrow it down to some sort of short list because it could have been a much longer book, many more examples of impressive innovation and cultural flourishing in history. But when I talk to historians and economic historians about what are the moments in time, the cultures that were really extraordinary and magnificent that would have to be in such a book, and these were the seven that were kind of on everybody's list in a way. So that's why they're there.
Okay. So what do you hope people would take away from reading this book?
Well, hopefully it's an easy way to learn some history. If people didn't pay attention to the history classes, it's a nice way to learn from antiquity and onwards what's been happening in the world. But I also think that there are some important lessons about the kind of institutions that promote innovation and growth and how this relates to usually their way of being open to new ideas and technologies from other places, but also create some freedom back home to allow people to test these ideas, technologies in strange new way and have them tested not by rulers and governments, but by the market, by users, and so that we get more ideas onto the table.
Certainly. So you've alluded to this already, but how do civilizations become civilized?
Yeah, it's a loaded term, being civilized. So before we go any further, I should also point out that these civilizations that I look at were not civilized in every respect. They all of them had systems of slavery that they upheld, different forms of oppression. Women rarely had any rights, or at least they were the second-class citizens in all of these cultures originally. But that, of course, didn't surprise their neighbors and contemporaries because that was the state throughout the rule throughout history. What set them apart was something else, that they managed to achieve these cultures of creativity and with many innovations in many different fields of life. And I think that if I were to sort of mention one formula, I would go to the great and ancient historian Thucydides from Greece, who pointed out there were two different mentalities in the world. One was the Athenian, of constantly going out into the world to try to learn something new and acquire something new. And the Spartan, which is to stay at home, shield yourself from the rest of the world to try to protect what you've already got. And broadly speaking, it's the Athenian mentality that allows you to come up, stumble on new ideas, innovations, and become a richer and more civilized society.
All right. Yeah, we'll get to the Athenian Spartan example in a bit. But I'd like to highlight this one paragraph that you wrote in the introduction to the book. Quote, if you want to situate my argument in the context of current cultural wars, I object to both the relativist idea that all cultures are equal and to the idea that there is a hierarchy of two opposing and clashing cultures, civilization versus barbarians, often associated with European culture, Judeo-Christian culture versus the rest. Okay, so please elaborate on this piece.
Yeah, those are two very common approaches to the study of civilizations and cultures. One of them saying that, oh, they're all different and is no way of evaluating whether anything is better or worse than anything else. So we're all equally good, which is to me a horrifying statement because in a way it means that if there are no values with which to measure how we're doing, in that case, we can't improve either. There is no way for us to be more civilized or worse, and which means that basically slavery and human rights are just as decent, and I don't buy that premise. So there are differences in how good societies are in terms of giving people the opportunities and the dignity to go about their lives in better ways. On the other hand, what's often a contrast to this relativism is the idea that there are just two different civilizations and they are constantly fighting. It's civilization versus barbarism. And then depending on who you are the civilized and the others are barbarians. What we notice when we look at history is that this shifts because cultures aren't sort of unified blocks that are frozen in times in terms of values and systems, but they constantly change. They're getting better and they're getting worse. And sometimes they're being replaced by another culture that used to be seen as the periphery or as the barbarians. They suddenly take the place of being the more decent, the more civilized, the more libertarian civilizations in history. So to me, there is not a clash between civilizations. It's a clash within every civilization on whether we should try to promote the better angels of our nature or to fall for the temptation of doing the short-sighted and the worse.
Okay. Well, I would venture to guess that you do not put much stock into the Clash of Civilizations thesis promoted by Harvard professor Samuel Huntington either.
Yeah, I think that he widely exaggerated the way in which these civilizations are frozen in time and constantly do battle with each other. And he always thought that they would be at war with one another. If we look at the world's most dangerous and tricky clashes and battlefields, they're often within these civilizations, often within countries and their civil wars, but also, the reason why Putin is invading Ukraine is not that he thinks it's a very completely different civilization, is that he thinks that it's the same kind of Slavic civilization and he has to destroy the more democratic version of it. China's threats against Hong Kong and Taiwan, the clash between Sunni and Shia Islam. Historically, of course, the Europe has torn itself apart again and again between Protestants or Catholics or totalitarians and Democrats. So I think the most vicious and pivotal conflicts are usually within civilizations, broadly speaking, rather than between them.
What do you find are first the material elements and also the non-material or human elements needed to form a civilization based on, these case studies?
Well, first of all, it's a cultural mentality that's needed, the kind of Athenian one where you think that progress is possible because, innovation is hard. It is tricky. Usually, most civilizations were close to subsistence level. And in that case, innovation is not popular because it is risky and you often fail. You try to freeze the situation at the stage where you are. You need something else. You need some kind of openness in terms of allowing ideas from other parts of society to come to fruition. So it's usually some form of checks on the arbitrary rule of the government, not necessarily democracy, because few of these historical civilizations had that, but some kind of balancing institution, some system of law that gave people more individual freedoms and rights. And then if you have that, it's usually makes it easier to move to the next level, and that's to have more of innovation, many of which you obviously borrow from other cultures and neighbors, learning from merchants and migrants and missionaries, but also using that to transform the business models and the technologies back home, which often happens in surprising ways.
Definitely. Okay. I'd also like to read another paragraph from the introduction. So, quote, the feeling will be familiar to many who have visited the great cities of history. I had come to Athens for the first time and made a pilgrimage to its democratic assembly, Plato's Academy, and Aristotle's Lyceum, and it left me with a sense of profound sadness. Here were the scenes of some of the most extraordinary moments in human history, and all that was left was rubble, garbage, and dark waste. Instead of bustling creativity, there was silence, interrupted only by the odd intoxicated passerby. So these are the civilizations which we have some information about. But give us a bit of a reflection on the civilization that were thriving, but we don't even know much about these days, such as, I suppose, the Babylonians and the Carthaginians.
Yeah, right. Yeah, those are magnificent examples that could have been there in the book as well. Um, you know, if they manage to find some sort of systems and institutions to keep going for a long time, it's probably because it's worth exploring the means by which they approach that. When it comes to the Mesopotamian cultures and later on Babylonian, there obviously that's the real cradle of civilizations, but not we don't have that much left from that era because it's often dry mud bricks rather than stone that built those societies. But we do know that we get the uh, first big systems of agriculture, first modern economies, first literary languages, systems of religion that we know anything about. So most things start over there. And then the whole region with the Egyptian empire as well. That was then in a way, the spark that set everything else going. And that was helped by the Phoenicians that built Carthage eventually, because they were the merchants and traders who really turned the whole Mediterranean into a unified culture with everything from their alphabet, their written language, to their system of commerce, which meant that ideas from any part of the Mediterranean could subtly be used and grow in other parts of the Mediterranean culture. So those are some quite impressive achievements.
Mhm. Now, you've alluded to this, but the element of creativity and innovation is what causes civilization to pass on. But I also like to highlight the idea of a tradition and a common culture. It's this element that well makes a civilization continues its central tenets. So how can these two, tradition, innovation, common culture versus innovation, how can they be harmonized? And how have the cultures, the civilizations that you've profiled, managed to reconcile these?
Yeah, that's a great question because there's always a balance there. You need input, you need imitation to constantly grow and prosper, but that has to be combined with something that you've got back home, some form of land in which to plant this and some sort of common culture. And often you when you strike the right balance, then you achieve something great. You need that common culture, to give people the sense that they um, have something in common with their neighbors and with the rest of society. It's something that often gives them energy, self-confidence. It creates a self-identity in these places that gives them more courage to experiment and to innovate and to go out into that world. But in order not to turn that into some sort of museum piece, you constantly have to regenerate it with inputs and ideas from elsewhere. And that's the difference between Athens and Sparta. Athens, they both had strong unified cultures, but a part of the Athenian self-identity was that we are the explorers. We constantly learn something new and constantly adapt to changing circumstances, and that makes us superior.
Mhm. So do you put much stock into the killer apps theory by Neil Ferguson in his book, Civilization, the West and the Rest?
I think that his list is not a bad list of killer apps of institutions that the British culture needed to in order to thrive. However, I do see many of these killer apps in these other civilizations as well. There are so many modern phenomena like everything from modern science to free expression to free markets that seem like it's a novel invention from the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and onwards, and the Scientific Revolution. However, as I explore in my book, this is something that the Athenians and the Romans and the Abbasids, and definitely the Song Chinese, were quite good at developing at another stage, obviously, and their cultures were cut short, but it's the kind of killer apps that were influential back then as well.
So the two, I guess, non-Western cultures or civilizations that you've profiled are the Song Chinese and the Abbasid um, Arabians. So what can the people of the West learn about the rise and falls of these non-Western civilizations?
Yeah, and I have to confess that those are the two cultures that I knew the least about when I
Mhm.
started researching this book as well. And what it taught me is first a sort of a broader meta point, and that's that it's not a Western phenomenon with progress and economic growth and technological innovation. It can appear in other places and other parts of the world as well. And 1,000 years ago, both the Muslim and the Chinese civilization was far superior to the European one. What we also learn, I think, is something about the kind of institutions that make them possible, from the commercialization of the arts, the industries, and of trade, how that functions, how important that is, but also how fragile it can be if you're dependent on just one benevolent despot. If you have one Abbasid caliph or one Chinese emperor, they can be great if they are sort of have the right mindset and think that we're going to leave more opportunities and freedoms to our peoples. Then they can make rapid progress, just like a benevolent dictator would be able to do, perhaps in the modern in our world. However, if that dictator turns out not to be a benevolent one, but on the contrary, a very oppressive and dark person who wants to cut technology, science, the economy short, then it's over with quite rapidly. And that's something I learned from both the Abbasid Caliphate and from China, then eventually under the Ming Dynasty. All it took was suddenly one decision, basically, from the rulers, and then it was over with. And I think that Europe, we had the same kind of rulers and churches who wanted to stop development and progress and freedoms, but they couldn't do it because Europe was too fragmented, so that eccentrics and entrepreneurs could always flee to another prince in another university somewhere and continue to develop these ideas. So sometimes there's strength in that decentralization.
Mhm. Yes, and that brings me to the example of the Dutch Republic, which was at its golden age the most tolerant place of Europe. That's where all the religious heretics and even the non-religious would go. And one of the great features about it is how radical its tolerance is. Um, I guess when you reflect on today's Netherlands, what do you think today's Dutchmen can learn from their ancestors?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that what we should learn from the Dutch Republic is that they became so remarkably successful and really the masters of the world because they didn't have much to begin with. They didn't have strong universities, strong intellectual traditions, no state church, no standing army. They didn't even have land on which to grow much food. So they had to make themselves dependent on international trade. And that was the spark for innovation to open up to the rest of the world and acquire new ideas from new arts traditions to refugees who came from all over Europe, not just Protestants who were persecuted in Catholic countries, but also dissident Catholics and Jews from Spain and Portugal. And that made them incredibly wealthy, not just in economic terms, but also in intellectual terms, because they got more ideas, they got more experiences from different places. And if there's so they basically kickstart the Enlightenment in the 17th century. I would say they were far ahead of the French and the British at that stage. Um, and that's something that I think that today's Dutch should learn from. Sometimes when I go to the Netherlands, they think that, oh, they're so worried that their traditions will be challenged and that anything from globalization to migration might undermine what they're doing. Perhaps they should be reminded that globalization and migration once upon a time made them into what they are.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I did not mention one of the Dutch Republic's most notable residents, Baruch or Benedict de Spinoza, whose works I learn a lot from.
An incredible intellectual pioneer in so many different fields
Yes.
in philosophical studies broadly, and his secular perspective on the world was hugely influential on the Enlightenment, but also in his early democratic ideas. He was a pioneer of classical liberalism in many ways. So obviously he was controversial even in the Dutch Republic.
Mhm. Yes. And of course, to allude to the name of this very podcast, um, so all seven of these civilizations promote in some aspects the study of philosophy. So why do you think this is important to the maintenance and flourishing of civilization?
Yeah, that's right. Often it happened by coincidence. They knew that they needed administrators, they needed engineers in order to build new societies, typically in the Abbasid Caliphate, when they suddenly inherited a huge empire from North Africa to Central Asia. So what do we do now? We need mathematicians, we need engineers to build roads and bridges and ships. So they needed to import many of those ideas. But when you do that, and when you try to then come up with more of an empirical based form of science, you need to compare methods. You need to think about what the concepts and the comparisons should consist in. And then suddenly you have to turn to philosophy because that's the science where you explore such things. So they discovered that they had to import also Greek philosophical ideas and translate those books into Arabic in order to prosper. So why is it so important for these societies? I think the basic reason is that it's not just that it means that it's the foundation of all the sciences. That's important in itself in order if you want to be able to continue to make progress. But it's also the very science that challenges and tests and questions everything else that is going on in those other sciences, but also in politics and in individual behavior. So if it's the case, and I happen to think that it is, that societies make progress when you challenge your traditional ways of doing things and test new novel ideas, then you need philosophy because that's the very place where you do that every day.
Mhm. Right. So the book mentions the great philosopher Plato a lot, but without, with some level of criticism, because what I read in Plato is he presents the character of Socrates, who's a model of free thought. But the model regime that Plato proposed is discourages, even condemns free thought in some ways. Um, so, to why did Plato believe this, and why should we reject it as a basis for civilized order?
Yeah, this is a great paradox in intellectual history. The person who really gave us sort of knowledge, so much knowledge about the wisdom of the Socratic method of constantly challenging and questioning and only thinking that he was more wise than others because he knew what he didn't know and had to constantly learn. That very person, Plato, who wrote Socrates' stories down eventually. He was the one who came up with a very central an idea of a very centralized orthodox idea, which gives us answers to all questions, but in a very closed-minded way. Why was that? Well, I think that in a way that's a good question. That's for Plato's biographers to find out. I think one reason why he went so far in that direction was that eventually the Athenian democracy decided to sentence Plato to death. And obviously this mistrust that Plato already had of open societies and of democracies turned into sort of this eagerness to build another very centralized society. But I think also Socrates started something important. He came up with all the best questions everywhere, but not the answers. So his disciples wanted to answer those questions. That's what they could do, and they did it in different ways. Plato did it in an impressive way, but in the end, in a mystical approach to metaphysics and epistemology, and in an authoritarian way in politics. But his disciple, Aristotle, made up for many of those mistakes, I think, by turning to the real world here and now and through empirical study and research, trying to find out what was the real answers to Socrates' questions. But it's a series of teachers, students that will never stop to amaze and teach us something, I think.
Um, so I detect that there are these two contrasting ideas regarding how you call it the law. Aristotle has this idea of the natural law, which has find its continuing adherence in some of the great proponents of freedom, say John Locke. But there's also the idea of the law of history, which finds its zenith, so to speak, in the philosophy of Hegel, and of course his rather notorious disciple Marx. Um, so why is one set of idea regarding the law leads to human freedom, while the other leads to, I suppose, as Hayek would say, serfdom?
Yeah, there is something about trying to find law here and now in our everyday life and our interactions with others and our in line with our human nature and the evolutionary growth of different ways of behaving towards one another, kind of a more common law evolutionary approach to law that seems to have inbuilt some degree of respect for individuals and for their different life projects. And on the other hand, the attempt to build some form of not bottom up, but top down patterns all throughout history, not just from where we've come, but also where we're going. That becomes much more abstract, and it abstracts away from individuals towards groups, classes, nations, races. And that's why so many of the disciples of Hegel, whether they're sort of left Hegelians or right Hegelians, they all thought that the important thing is the law of history and the battle between these abstract forces and groups and classes. And in that battle, and to make sure that it turns out in the right way, the individual must be sacrificed. The individual doesn't really mean anything in this context. And obviously, that's two different versions of the law that are really opposites. One being about basically the rules of the road, just like you have traffic signals and you decide on which way you drive, right or left, to make sure that we don't collide and destroy one another's life projects. That's one approach. The other one being trying to tell everybody where they should be going and why, and force them to do it if they don't.
So you've alluded to this a few questions before, but do you find that the worst enemy of civilization, as in the state of being civilized itself, can be found from without or from within?
Yeah, obviously, raiding armies and natural disasters and bubonic plague has been known to wreck a civilization or two again and again. However, what I find in history is also that cultures can bounce back from disasters like that, and even invasions is not always the end. You can rebuild cities, and the knowledge you had acquired doesn't you usually don't lose and forget all of that knowledge. But the one enemy that you have a very hard time to ever beat is yourself. And when you're losing that Athenian spirit, that sense of curiosity and of openness that made you progress. And often there's an interaction here. Often in these societies started to decline in times of crisis when they became fearful of the world, and that resulted in an ambition to go back home basically and build walls against trade, against intellectual exchange. You know, the death to Socrates moment in a way when people say, "Oh, the world is now so dangerous, so we have to find something pure, safe, and stable and purge society or universities of dissenting ideas." Once that happens, it's really difficult to return because then you shut off the engine of new ideas and of innovation. So that's why the enemy within, which is often ourselves, sort of within our own human nature, is the most dangerous one because he keeps coming back and try to scare us away from freedom again and again.
Mhm. Okay. So in terms of all seven of these civilizations' answer to the question, who should rule, um, who would you say come closest to, I guess, the right answer?
Yeah, well, we'll see because we're still trying to find out. What I would say historically is that benevolent despots might look good if they're really benevolent and kind and decent, but they rarely are for a long time. And for every benevolent despot, you have 100 awful ones. So some sort of decentralization of power is incredibly important. A division of power where you have other counterbalancing forces and systems of law that constantly checks that power is important. And to me, and again, this is why I say we're about to find out. I think that the best attempt in world history to build a system like that, I would say, is the American system after independence from Britain, because Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, most of all, I think James Madison, the lead author of the Constitution, they learned so much from previous attempts and failures, and they really discussed the Greek and the Roman examples in history and came up with the idea that power has to be, first of all, divided in local, regional, and national levels. But then at each of these levels, it has to be separated between different forces, the legislative branch, the executive, and the legal branch, to make sure that, because understood human nature to the extent that they said, we'll never get rid of this passion for power, these attempts to control everybody else. So we have to find a system where the passions balance and hopefully equal each other out, so that they have to fight each other for power, and not give way to just one powerful executive. We'll see whether that works in the long run, or if America returns to a monarchy at some point. But so far, I would say that it seems like the most promising system.
Mhm. Yes, and of course, the early Americans learned a lot from classical Greece and Republican Rome, and that brings me to I guess, a question that I'm still trying to find the answer to, which is, to what extent are the regrettable falls of these two civilizations a result of, or a bug in their system of governance, or a logical conclusion to the features of their systems of government?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we have to look at them separately. In a way, I think they fell in different ways. I think that Athens, specifically in Greece, was quite impressive and remained relatively intact until it was subsumed and destroyed by Philip and then Alexander the Great of Macedonia, which just conquered them on the battlefield and moved on then to conquer most of the known world. So that I mean, that happened to all Greek city-states, no matter what kind of political system they had. Even though they might have lost some strength before, I think that's more of the Roman experience. I think the Roman Empire really fell in the, Ernest Hemingway's form of a bankruptcy. You go bankrupt in two ways, first gradually and then suddenly. So Rome had been in decline for 300 years, I think, before they were eventually then invaded by barbarians from different places. And that was more of, I wouldn't say that it was in the original foundation of the Roman institutions, because what made them impressive, the Romans, I think, was their system, their way of decentralizing the empire. They conquered new provinces, but they allowed those provinces to govern themselves and to have and then absorb many of their technologies and their talents, obviously. But that meant that always had they made use of the of local ambitions, energy, and production all the time. What began to change eventually was that the emperors became more powerful, more power hungry, and they began to centralize the empire. Partly because they thought they had to when they were attacked on different sides, partly just because of power, greed for power. And that centralization meant that it sounds great. You sound powerful when you govern everything from Rome, but it also means that you have a single point of failure. If you lose out someplace, it means that locally you don't have the plan B, the alternative center of power, growth, and of ambition. So they became more exposed as time went by.
Okay. So do elaborate on the element of hubris and how that can contribute to the fall of civilizations.
Yeah. Uh, it's not just the sort of Spartan going home and hiding away from the world that might result in decline, but also over enthusiastic Athenians going abroad everywhere to try to, well, build democracies all over Greece, which was one ambition, but also to steal and acquire loot and resources from other places, which means that you might overextend yourself and do more than you have it within your power to accomplish. The closest thing to a self-imposed sort of hubristic suicide was during the long Peloponnesian War against Sparta, when the Athenians came to the conclusion that let's not just fight this war, let's go all the way to Sicily and beat one of the local despots over there in order to take all the treasure that exists over there, which was an incredibly reckless and dangerous expedition that risked most of their fleet and most of their soldiers, and it ended in tragedy, and they almost lost the whole Peloponnesian War just because of this hubristic ambition. And obviously, it's hard not to see some parallels with our modern era. When America was at its most had its most superiority technologically, economically against the rest of the world after the end of the Cold War, when they thought that they could rearrange the whole Middle East by invading Afghanistan, invading Iraq, and just rebuild some sort of democratic institutions there, resulting not just in a gigantic loss of human lives and wealth, but also changing the perspective from this outward going to, oh, we'd better stay at home and not do anything abroad in the future, perhaps resulting in more of a protectionist mindset as well. So history is a long series of unintended consequences. And if you're too hubristic, you might end up being too isolationist in the next stage.
Yes. Yeah, I've been reading History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, and it's a fascinating reading experience. Because I think at the start, because the book is written from an Athenian perspective, you kind of hope that Athens, with all this military, technological, and cultural superiority, would win the Spartans. But then, as you read, you find that increasingly the faults that lies at the heart of Athens reveal itself gradually and gradually, culminating in that part when the Athenian delegate just says, well, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And at that point, it's like, well, they kind of had their loss coming.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And this is one of the reasons why it's one of the greatest books in world literature, I think, because Thucydides does not just describe the war in such impressive detail. Apparently, he must have collected so many stories, but also his insightful look into human nature and how it deteriorates throughout this war, even in Athens. They were so proud originally, their sort of their libertarian heritage. We're so different from Sparta because here we have individual rights and democracy, and that's what we're fighting for. But eventually, as they go on, that character deteriorates. You become more tribal, more aggressive. You're beginning to search for scapegoats back home, and you're beginning to destroy other cities and cultures just to take their wealth. And exactly this Melian dialogue, which is the sort of the most awful expression of that, where the Athenian basically stops coming up with any kind of arguments for their attacks and just saying, oh, we're stronger. We can do whatever we like, and the weak will suffer what they must. And that's and the worrying thing, of course, is as Thucydides points out, this will be repeated in human history again and again. Not because history repeats itself, but because human nature repeats itself. We have partly the decent, um, open-minded libertarian trader within us, but we also have the tribalist, the aggressor, the Spartan within us, and that shows throughout that conflict.
Well, I guess since you mentioned the Americans and their recent misadventures in the Middle East, I find that there's a pattern that's repeated throughout history where a culture reaches civilization status and it believes that it has cracked the code to civilization building and government structure, and it seeks to perpetuate that model onto other cultures and civilizations. And it always not only ends up failing in that attempt, but it also leads to a kind of destabilization within their own cultures. So how do we reconcile this idea that your invention of, say, the federalist system may be good, but how you applied it to other countries, nations, and cultures is something that you should be very careful about.
Yeah, that's a very good question. It seems like it's incredibly difficult to impose um, decent, productive, functioning institutions on other cultures against their will. Even if you happen to have come across the recipe uh, for golden ages, just moving into a territory and telling everybody to do this, that's not the way it works. When I look at history and these episodes where you see these sudden explosions of creativity and innovation, it usually comes from a strong uh, experience in those cultures where they learned that, oh, it was this kind of approach that helped us to move on. Let's then try to extend that and deepen those institutions and protect those institutions and move on. That's how you build lasting, sustainable golden ages. Whereas trying to impose them from abroad seems incredibly tricky and often results in severe unintended consequences. And so I think that the best one can do from afar is to look at other cultures and civilizations and think about, so what is it within this culture and its tradition that has been historically um, productive, growing, dynamic, respectful of individual rights and of openness? And is there any ways to emphasize and strengthen that part rather than trying to come up with something else to make people rediscover what they already have within themselves? And obviously the best way to do that is just to set an example, to be a role model and show what works if you take those institutions seriously back home.
Now, of course, the polar opposite of imperialism, this idea that this one manner of government structure should be imposed upon other cultures, is isolationism. It means that you keep all of the gifts of your own civilization to yourself, even at the cost of your own stability. So, what have you found to be a good middle ground between isolationism and imperialism?
Yeah, there's an I mean, this is Aristotle and some of the ancient Greeks always looked for the sort of the golden mean, some sort of perfect balance between two mistakes. But this was really often between being hubristic and being cowardly. You find sort of courage in between, but sometimes that's a completely different character than the other false alternatives. And when it comes to being imperialistic or isolationist, I would say being open in your exchange with the rest of the world. That would be probably be a more Aristotelian golden mean. Whereas and setting an example and trying to be a role model. Don't be embarrassed of your own institutions, but instead loudly proclaim why you think they are important and show the results in practice. But don't go out there and try to slay monsters in various places, because that's often something that results in this imperialistic attitude. And as Athens showed during the Peloponnesian War, in times of war, it hurts your own character as well and hurts your own society as well.
Now, as I read the book, I find that the idea of an individual that can belong to a given socio-political, cultural context and yet maintain some independence from that very context, it's a powerful one. And it's what you'd call an innovation that's managed to last. And it's contributed to the flourishing of civilization. And if that idea is jeopardized in some way, shape, or form, that actually leads to the decline of civilization. So, why do you believe the individual matter?
Well, the individual as such, why she matters in the world is that that's all we've got. It's all those groups and classes that we're talking about, they're made up of individuals. And if we care about anything, it should be those individuals. But also, obviously, I happen to be a methodological individualist. I think that it's the proper way of trying to analyze the world and those groups and classes as well. They don't have a mind of their own. We have to look at the individual and at human nature to explain and understand what is going on and where we're going next. So, classes and nations, they don't have real interests or hopes and dreams. If they do, it's only because some individuals in those groups have managed to convince the others or impose their own dreams, ambitions, and will on the other individuals over there. But we have to pay attention to all of the rest of them as well.
Right. I'd like to end with this. You mentioned the idea of today's as Western civilization um, being challenged in terms of faith in itself. So, how do you think that Western faith can be regained?
Well, if this is the end point of our discussion, I think it's important to broaden that question to what I think is the whole point of my book. It's to show that golden ages or great thriving civilization is not a fate. It's not something that just appears somewhere out of sheer luck or historical destiny. It is something that has appeared in unexpected places historically, and different places, and often as a complete surprise to not just the surprised bystanders, but also people within that civilization. And it's because, for one reason or another, they managed to build certain institutions and build on top of those institutions. So that tells us two things. It tells us that um, it's not it's possible everywhere, but it's not guaranteed anywhere. I mean, in the ninth century, the greatest civilization on the planet was the Muslim civilization extending all the way to Afghanistan. Afghanistan, of course, now today is one of the poorest and most oppressed societies on the planet. And I think it's a perfect and unfortunate example of the fact that it's possible everywhere, but it's not guaranteed to last anywhere. It takes a struggle. It takes a battle of ideas, and it takes some courage in constantly renewing your civilization. And to go back to your question then of the West in a broader sense, what's next? I think it's incredibly important to realize that we've been through a series of shocks in the world, from geopolitical tensions to the pandemic to wars. And it's easy to see how you can become distraught and fearful of the world, and it's tempting to sort of try to look back to some go potential created better old days in the past. That's not how you build golden ages or protect them. You only do it by constantly acquiring new ideas and new knowledge. And if more of the growth and the innovations will take place elsewhere, there's only one way in which we can benefit from it, and that's to be open to it and to constantly learn from it and adapt our institutions and business models and technologies to that. So my basic message is we have to be Athenian in spirit. That's the way to protect golden ages.
Okay, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you very much, Johan Norberg, for joining the show.
Thank you.